The train came in just after noon, when the dust from the morning freight had settled, but the heat had not. Harlan Crossing was the kind of town that noticed arrivals the way it noticed weather. Not with alarm, but with the quiet attention of people who had little else to vary their days. The platform was never truly empty. A man leaning against the water barrel, two women near the milliner's door with their heads angled just slightly toward the tracks. She stepped down from the third car with a carpet bag in one hand and a smaller satchel looped over her forearm. She wore a gray traveling dress that had been pressed before she boarded and had not survived the journey particularly well. She stood on the platform and looked at the street with an expression that gave nothing away. Not hope, not dread, not the particular brightness of someone performing composure. She simply looked, the way a person looks when they are taking in information they will need later. He was supposed to meet her at 11. She set the carpet bag down at her feet and waited. The sun moved a quarter inch across the sky. A dog crossed the far end of the street. The man by the water barrel did not look at her directly, but he did not look away either. She opened the smaller satchel and took out a folded letter. Read it once, though she clearly knew its contents. Folded it again and put it back. He arrived at noon from the direction of the livery, not running, not apologetic in his gait, but moving with the slightly increased purpose of a man who knows he is late and has decided not to make the lateness larger by drawing attention to it. He was a few years past 30, broad through the shoulders, with a kind of face that suggested he had spent more of his life working outdoors than in rooms. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at the carpet bag, then at her. He said, "I'm late," she said. "I noticed." He picked up the carpet bag before she could reach for it. Not as a courtesy that announced itself. He simply picked it up and stood. He asked if she'd eaten. She said she'd had something on the train. He nodded once and started toward the street. She fell into step beside him, not behind. The two women near the milliner's door turned their heads a fraction. The man by the water barrel shifted his weight. The house was 6 blocks south and 1 block west, near the edge of town where the road opened into open country past the last storefront. He'd told her this in the letter. What he hadn't told her, or hadn't thought to, was that the house sat slightly apart from its neighbors, with a single cottonwood in the yard that had grown at an angle, leaning east as if the years of western wind had finally accumulated into something visible. She looked at the tree when they came through the gate. She didn't say anything about it. The house was not what she'd had expected, though she hadn't let herself expect much. One story, clapboard, white paint, gone gray at the edges. A porch with 2 steps, one of which gave slightly under his boot as he came up it. He noticed her notice it. Inside was plain and deliberate. A table, 2 chairs. An iron stove that still held morning warmth. A window facing the yard and the cottonwood and the road past it. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and looked at each thing once. Not judging, taking inventory the way someone does when they are calculating what kind of work lies ahead. He set the carpet bag near the door to the second room. He said, "It's small," she said. "It's enough." He nodded once and went to the stove, which was his way of occupying himself when the words ran out, which was often. He put a pot on. She watched him for a moment, then looked at the shelves beside the stove. Flour, salt, lard in a tin, a small crock that might have been sourdough starter. She crossed to it and lifted the lid and smelled it. It was old enough to be reliable. She set the lid back down carefully. He said there was bread from the store, but it was 2 days old. He said it without apology. She turned from the shelf and said, "I can make some." He said there was no need tonight. She said it wasn't for tonight. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he said nothing. She asked where things were, and he showed her. The flour sack, the salt box, the water bucket he'd filled that morning. She didn't ask twice about anything. She didn't open drawers that weren't her business. She moved through the kitchen with the attention of someone learning a new instrument, pressing no keys yet, only touching the shape of the thing. he poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot. He set one on the end of the table nearest the stove and kept one himself and stood near the window. The light outside was going amber. The cottonwood threw a long shadow east across the yard. She sat without being invited and wrapped both hands around the cup. For a while, neither of them spoke, the kind of quiet that is not comfortable yet, but is not hostile either. It was the quiet of two strangers who have each separately agreed to try. He asked, without looking away from the window. How long was the train? She said. 2 days, and part of a third, he said. That's a long way to come not knowing. She looked at her cup. It's a long way to come knowing, too, tea, she said. He turned from the window then. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away, back at the fading yard. The yard went dark before either of them moved. She finished her coffee. He finished his. He took both cups to the basin without asking if she was done, and she did not offer to help. The division was natural, the way a room finds its own temperature after a door is closed. He showed her where the extra blankets were folded on the shelf in the back room. He showed her the hook on the inside of the door and the latch that needed to be lifted at an angle to catch properly. He demonstrated it once, without comment, and she watched his hands and then tried it herself. It caught. He nodded and stepped back. He said, "Pumps around back. Water runs cold at night and warm by midday if you let it stand," he said. "Outhouse is past the woodpile. I keep a lantern on the post," he said. "Breakfast is early here. You don't have to come down if you're not ready," she said. "I'll come down." He left her then. She heard his boots on the stairs, slow and even, and then the sound of a door closing somewhere above, and then nothing. She stood in the middle of the small room for a moment. There was a window facing west, curtained with something thin and faded, a bed with an iron frame, a wool blanket, a pillow that looked newer than everything else in the house, a low table with a candle stub in a tin holder. She did not know who had made the room ready or when, whether it had been waiting a week or whether he had done it that morning after her letter, the one that said, "I arrived Thursday," and nothing else. She unpacked only what she needed for the night. Her other things stayed in the case. The candle she did not light. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds a new house makes, the settle of wood. Something moving in the yard, slow and unhurried, probably the horse. Wind in the cottonwood, a dry sound, like paper being turned. She thought about the train. The conductor who had not looked at her after he read her ticket. The woman across the aisle who had looked too long and then looked away with an expression that was not unkind, but was something close to pity. She had not let herself think about what she was going toward during those 2 days. She had thought only about what she was leaving, and even that she had thought about carefully, in pieces, the way you eat something that is too hot. Now she was here. The room was small and plain and smelled of pine soap and old wood. It was not unwelcoming. That was the thing she turned over as she lay down, still dressed, on top of the blanket. It was not unwelcoming. She woke before light, not from a sound, from the absence of the sounds she knew. The neighbor's dog in the alley, the milk cart on the cobblestones, the particular creak of the building she had lived in for 11 years, settling against the cold. None of those sounds were here. What was here was wind and the cottonwood, and somewhere beneath both of those, the slow breathing of a place that did not know her yet. She lay still for a moment, then she got up. The kitchen was dark but not difficult. She had taken note of it the evening before, the stove, the wood box, the shelf where the flour tin sat. She moved without lighting a lamp, feeling her way by the layout she had memorized the way she memorized most things. Once, carefully, and then kept. The wood box had enough. She built the fire small and patient, the way her mother had shown her, the way that did not waste. She found the flour tin and lifted the lid. Half full, maybe a little more. There was salt in a covered crock beside it. Lard in a blue bowl, with a plate pressed over the top. She looked for yeast and did not find any. What she found on a lower shelf was a small clay pot sealed with wax. She worked the wax loose with her thumbnail. Sourdough starter, still alive, something in it that smelled sharp and faintly sweet and very old. She stood there a moment holding the pot. Someone had kept this going. Fed it, sealed it, put it back on the shelf. It was not something you did by accident or out of obligation. It was something you did because you intended to use it eventually, or because you could not bring yourself to let it die. She put the pot on the counter and got to work. She did not measure. She had not measured in years. Her hands knew the weight of a good dough before her mind had finished deciding on it. She worked it against the board until it had the right give, covered it with a cloth, and set it near the stove to prove. Then she washed her hands and put the kettle on. Outside, the sky was beginning to separate from the land. A thin line of gray along the east, barely distinguishable from the dark above it. The yard was still. The horse was a shape against the fence, head down, patient. She heard a board shift in the hallway. Then nothing. She did not turn around. She set 2 cups on the counter, the same as he had the night before, and listened to the kettle begin its slow approach toward boiling. The dough was resting. The fire was steady, the kitchen smelled of warm cast iron and something just beginning. After a moment, she heard him pull out a chair and sit down. The kettle began to sound, not boiling yet, but working toward it, a low, steady hiss that filled the silence without breaking it. She did not look at him. She kept her hands on the counter, one on each side of the cups, and waited for the water to be ready. He did not speak either. Outside, a bird started up somewhere in the cottonwoods past the fence. One call, then nothing. The gray line along the east had widened slightly, the dark above it beginning to soften at its edges. She poured the water when it was ready and set the kettle back. She turned then, carrying both cups, and set his down in front of him the same way he had done hers the night before. No commentary, no ceremony. She sat across from him and wrapped her hands around her own cup. He looked at the cup. Then he looked at the cloth-covered dough near the stove. She watched him notice it. He said nothing, but something in his posture changed. A small settling, like a man who had come in from a long walk and not yet admitted he was tired. They drank. The fire ticked inside the stove. The room was warm near the center of it and cool at the walls where the morning had not yet reached. She could hear the horse shift at the fence, hooves on the hard ground. After a time he said, "You were up early. I couldn't sleep." She said it plainly, without apology. He nodded once, as though that answered something he hadn't asked. She watched him turn the cup in his hands. His fingers were calloused at the tips and along the outer edge of the palm, the particular wear of someone who worked with rope and wood in roughly equal measure. She had not meant to notice that. She looked back at her cup. "The bread takes a while," she said, "to prove, then to bake. Probably an hour and a half yet. There's no hurry." It was a simple thing to say. She was not sure why it landed the way it did. Not heavily, but cleanly, like something set down with care on a steady surface. She got up after a while and checked the dough, lifting the cloth at one corner. It had risen well in the warmth. She pressed 2 fingers gently into the surface and watched the indentation hold its shape. She covered it again. He was watching her when she turned around, not with the particular attention of a man measuring a woman, but with something quieter, the way a person watches something that is working the way it ought to, and is content to let it continue. She sat back down. The light outside was changing. The gray had given way to something pale and faint, not quite color yet, but moving toward it. She could see the outline of the mountains now, just barely above the far edge of the yard. The mountains held the darkness a little longer than the rest of the sky. She had noticed that before, in other places, how the high country was always the last to let go of the night. He got up and put more wood in the stove without being asked. He did not say anything about it, just lifted the iron handle, added 2 splits, and lowered it closed again. The small sound of the latch settling was the only commenting on the act. She wrapped her hands around her cup. There was a cat she had not noticed before, a gray one, that came in from somewhere and sat near the base of the stove with its eyes half closed. She watched it. It did not acknowledge her. It had the settled look of something that had claimed its place a long time ago, and did not feel it needed defending anymore. Yours, she asked. He looked at it, showed up last winter, stayed. She nodded. There was a whole life in that. The animal arriving uninvited, the man not turning it out, some quiet negotiation that had never needed words, and now here it was, at home. She thought of the bag by the door, still there, still hers to pick up. He refilled both cups without asking, which she noticed, and then he sat back down in his chair and looked out the window the same way she had been doing. The mountains were lighter now, lavender almost, the color that came just before the real color came. How long have you been here? She asked. In Harlan. He thought about it the way he seemed to think about most things, not as a performance of consideration, but because he was actually calculating. 8 years, he said, going on 9. She did not know what she expected him to say. It was longer than she had assumed. 8 years in a place meant something. It meant the town had grown around him, or he had grown around it. The loose step on his porch had been loose for some portion of those 8 years, and he had left it so, or not noticed, or noticed and not cared. She found she did not know yet which of those it was. She was not sure it mattered. You always been a carpenter? She asked. No. He did not offer more, and she did not press. She had her own things she had not said, and it felt right to extend the same courtesy. The dough would need perhaps another 20 minutes before she should shape it. She was tracking that the way she tracked most things now, not with anxiety, just with the steady background attention of someone who had learned that the small, practical tasks were the ones worth honoring. The cat shifted near the stove and resettled itself with one paw tucked under its chest. The pale light outside was thickening slowly toward morning. He set his coffee cup down and stood. Not abruptly. Nothing he did was abrupt, but with the deliberate economy of a man who had decided on a thing and was simply following through. He crossed to the small window beside the door and looked out at the yard. The frost on the ground was beginning to soften at the edges, not melting yet, just releasing its grip slightly, the kind of morning that couldn't decide. She watched him without appearing to. Had a different trade before, he said, still facing the window. Before I came here, she waited. Worked for the railroad, survey crew, he paused. 18 months of that, she said nothing. The dough was in its final rise, and she could feel without looking at it that the kitchen had warmed properly. The heat from the stove reaching into the corners now. Something happened, she asked, not prying, just leaving the door open a crack if he wanted it. He turned from the window. Nothing dramatic. He said it plainly, not defensively. Just decided I'd rather make something stand than mark where something would. She considered that. There was a fullness to it that he hadn't intended to show, she thought. Or maybe he had and simply trusted she would handle it without making anything of it. She did. That makes sense, she said, and that was all. He came back to the table and picked up his cup, and she turned to check the dough. It had risen well. She pressed 2 fingers lightly into the surface, and the impression held its shape for a moment before slowly filling back. Ready. She dusted the board and turned the dough out onto it. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, pressing, folding, dividing, and she was aware of him watching, not intrusively, the way a person watches something they find quietly interesting, without meaning to make a point of it. The cat stood from its place near the stove and stretched, spine arching, then walked with proprietary slowness to the base of the table and sat. "Does it always do that when you bake?" she asked. "Wouldn't know," he said. "Haven't had baking in the house." She glanced at him. He was looking at the cat. She shaped the loaf and set it in the tin and slid it into the oven. The door closed with a small clean sound. She straightened and wiped her hands on the cloth and looked at the window. The frost in the yard had softened further. A thin line of gold was pressing up at the edge of the tree line, not sunrise yet, just its advance notice. He was still at the table. He had no immediate place to be. She understood that now, not as imposition, but as something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. The bread would take 40 minutes. Neither of them moved toward filling the time. The 40 minutes passed the way cold mornings sometimes do, slowly at first, then all at once. She stood at the window for a while. He stayed at the table. The cat sat between them, like it had been placed there by someone with an opinion about the arrangement. She found a cloth and wiped down the counter she had already wiped. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table without lifting it. Neither of them spoke, and the silence had changed from the silence of strangers into something with more texture. Not comfortable exactly, but honest. The kind that asks nothing. At some point he stood and went to the window near the door and looked out at the yard. She could see from his posture that he was checking something practical. The light, the ground, what the day was going to ask of him. His shoulders carried the question without urgency. He looked the way men look when they have learned not to dread the answer. The smell came before the time was up. It came as warmth first, and then as something more specific. The brown, faintly sweet smell of crust forming, of the inside of the loaf beginning to press outward against its own skin. She felt it before she registered she was feeling it. Something in her chest eased, a tightness she had held for so many days she had stopped noticing it was there. She looked at him. He had turned from the window. He was looking at the oven. His expression had not changed, not exactly, but something around his eyes had shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts on its hinge when the wind leans against it from the other side. He wasn't looking at the oven. He was somewhere else for just a moment. Where, she couldn't say. Somewhere the smell had taken him. She didn't ask. She pulled the cloth from the counter and opened the even door, and the heat came out in a wave, and the loaf sat in its tin with a crust the color of late afternoon. Amber at the crown, pale at the sides where the tin had held it. She lifted it with the cloth and set it on the counter, and it made a small sound against the wood, solid, settled, the sound of something that had become what it was meant to be. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the bread. A long moment then, "That's a good loaf." 3 words. Flat, unornamented. The tone a man uses when he means something and knows it doesn't need dressing. She looked back at the bread. The crust was still moving, barely, a faint crackle as it cooled, the sound of settling. "It needs 10 minutes before cutting," she said. "I know," he said. She had not expected that. She didn't show that she hadn't expected it. She set the cloth down, and they both waited. The 10 minutes passed the way. Time passes when 2 people are standing near each other, and neither one is pretending to be somewhere else. She did not busy herself. That was the thing. Another woman might have found a cloth to fold, a pot to move, something to occupy her hands and justify the standing there. She didn't. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and watched the loaf and let the time be what it was. He stood on the other side of the counter. The light through the window had gone the color of weak tea. Late afternoon, thinning toward evening, the way it did in October when the sun dropped early and without announcement. Outside, someone crossed the street. A horse at the rail shifted its weight. The ordinary sounds of the town going about its business, indifferent to what was happening in this kitchen. After a while, she reached for the bread knife. A plain thing, wooden handle, worn smooth at the grip, the blade darkened from years of use. She turned the tin and pressed one finger lightly to the top of the loaf. The crust gave just enough and sprang back. She nodded to herself, small, private. Then she set the blade to the end and cut. The inside was pale gold and close-grained. Steam lifted from the cut face in a single slow curl. She cut a second slice and set it on the counter in front of him without looking up. He didn't move for a moment. Then he picked it up, held it, took a bite. She waited, he chewed, set the slice down, looked at the window. She watched the side of his face, the jaw, the small muscle at the hinge of it. She had learned in the past several weeks that his face said most things there rather than in his eyes. The eyes were careful. The jaw was not. "My mother used a different hand," he said, not to her, more to the window, to the particular way the light was falling. more water than milk, denser. He picked up the slice again. This is better. She looked back down at the loaf. She cut a slice for herself, though she wasn't hungry. And she ate it standing there, and it tasted the way it always tasted, like her mother's kitchen, like the particular cold of the mornings when she had learned it, like something that belonged to her in a way almost nothing in this town yet did. I can teach it, she said, then stopped, uncertain why she had said it, who she had meant it for. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking for that, he said. She nodded. She hadn't thought he was. She didn't know why she'd offered. Outside, the horse at the rail shifted again, and the light kept going. She wrapped the remaining bread in cloth and set it on the shelf where she kept the things that needed to be used within a day. He stood a moment longer. She could hear him deciding something, though she couldn't have said how she knew. He picked up his hat from the chair where he'd left it. There's a loose board on the back step, he said. I noticed it this morning. I noticed it last week. He turned the hat in his hands once. I can fix it this afternoon if you have a spare nail or two. She told him there were nails in the tin near the woodpile. He nodded, the way he nodded at practical information. No acknowledgement beyond the receiving of it, and he went out through the back. She stayed where she was and listened to him find the tin, sort through it, crouch at the step. The small sounds of it. The tap of the hammer, irregular at first, then settled into something steady. She washed the knife she'd used for the bread. She did not go to the window to look. He worked for maybe 20 minutes. When he came back in, he set the remaining nails on the counter in a small, loose pile. Not all of them, just the ones he hadn't used. And that small economy of it, the not taking more than he'd needed, did something to her she didn't have a name for. Step'll hold now, he said. Thank you. He put his hat on. The afternoon light had shifted while he was outside, moved off the counter and up the wall toward the ceiling the way it did in this part of the day. And for a moment, the kitchen was dimmer than it had been. That bread, he said. He stopped. She waited. My boy asked this morning what it was I'd brought home last night. He looked at the shelf where the cloth-wrapped loaf sat. I didn't know how to answer him. She thought about that. The boy asking. The pause before the answer. What did you tell him? I told him it was bread. She almost smiled. Not quite. That's accurate. He looked at her then, directly in the way he rarely did. Not long, not searching, just a moment of straight looking. He wants to know where it came from. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the horse at the rail was gone. Someone had ridden out while they were talking, and she hadn't heard it. You can tell him, she said. If he asks again, he nodded once, he went to the door. She watched his hand on the frame, the pause there, fingers just resting against the wood. And then he was outside, and his boots crossed the porch and descended the step, the one he'd fixed which did not give. The afternoon came in slow. She worked through it without thinking much, mended 2 shirts that had been waiting since Tuesday, reset a button on a wool coat someone had left with a note tucked in the collar. The light moved across the floor the way it always did, reaching the far leg of the table by 3, retreating before 4. She thought about the boy. Not the man, not the bread, not the question that had sat in the kitchen after he left. The boy. The particular shape of a child's curiosity. Not suspicious, not cautious, just open and direct the way only children were. Where did it come from? As if the answer would settle something important that he hadn't known was unsettled. She folded the wool coat and set it on the pile. There was flour left, not much, but enough. She'd been rationing it, without acknowledging she was rationing it, making the bag last in the way she made everything last. Quietly, without ceremony, adjusting portions so gradually she barely noticed the adjustment herself. She looked at what remained. She thought about the boy's question. She thought about the man's hand on the door frame, the pause before he stepped off the porch. She made a second loaf. It took most of what she had. She worked the dough the same way, not differently, not with any particular intention she could name. Just the same basic press and fold, the same heel of the hand, the same patience. The oven was still holding heat from the afternoon. She let it go in before the last of the warmth faded. While it baked, she sat at the table and did nothing. That was rare. She was not someone who sat and did nothing. But the light was doing something particular at that hour. Low and amber, coming through the window at a flat angle that made the dust on the sill look like something deliberate. And she was tired in a way that was not unpleasant. Tired the way you get after a thing has been decided and you don't yet know what comes next. The loaf came out even. Better than the first, maybe. Though she knew that was the warmth of completion talking, and not any real difference in the bread. She wrapped it, not in the cloth she kept for her own things. She had a piece of plain muslin she'd been saving for nothing specific, and she cut a square from it and wrapped the loaf the way you'd wrap something meant to travel. Tight at the ends, folded under, solid. She tied it with a length of twine from the drawer. She set it on the counter next to the lamp. She did not let herself think too carefully about what she intended to do with it. She only knew she would not eat it herself. She carried it in the morning, not early, not before anyone was out, which would have meant something she wasn't prepared to mean. She waited until the street had a few people on it, until the general store had its door propped open, and the sound of a cart was coming from somewhere past the livery. Then she picked up the loaf and walked. His house was 4 blocks. She had counted without meaning to some weeks ago, and the number had stayed with her, the way useless information sometimes does. The step was solid under her foot when she came up onto the porch. The loose board had been replaced. She could see where the new plank sat a shade lighter than the rest, the grain running clean. She looked at it for a moment before she knocked. He opened the door in his work clothes. There was sawdust on his sleeve, which meant he'd been at something since before light. She held out the loaf. He looked at it, then at her. She said it was extra, that the oven ran hot and she'd made 2. And there was no point keeping the second. He took it from her. His hands were careful with it in a way that made her look at the porch rail instead. He said she didn't have to do that. She said she knew. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Down the street, someone called out to someone else, and a horse moved, and the ordinary morning went on being ordinary around them. He asked if she wanted to come in. She thought about it honestly, standing there, not performing consideration, actually thinking. She said not this morning. He nodded once, not deflated, not satisfied either, just receiving the answer she'd given him. She stepped back off the porch, turned to go. He said her name. Just that, her name, quiet. The way you'd say a word you'd been turning over for a while to see how it fit in the mouth. She stopped. She did not turn around right away. She looked at the new plank on the step, the lighter wood, the clean grain of it, the work he'd done without saying anything to anyone. Then she turned. He was still in the doorway with the loaf in his hands, the sawdust on his sleeve, the flat morning light on the side of his face. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She stood there one breath. Then, she said she might have time tomorrow morning. He said all right. She walked back down the 4 blocks with the sun still low and the dust still pale on everything, and the town going about its business the way it always had. Nobody watched. Nobody needed to. The loaf was already gone from her hands, and she felt the absence of it the way you feel something that has landed exactly where it belonged.